Okay. Gotta start over.
Ross is reading.
Oh, whoa. Sound is off.
Okay, let's do a test here. I'll give a couple of minutes to make sure everything's working. Hopefully, I have resolved our technical difficulties.
Yeah.
We good?
Uh-huh.
All right, let's start over. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your patience. I had a small glitch that I got straight. So I wanted to say, getting started this morning, I wanted to take just a moment and recognize a significant event that happened on this day. I told you, but you couldn't read my lips well enough previously. Today is July the 11th, and July the 11th marks a special anniversary for me because it is the date on which I lost my job in industry. And had a very good job, a very good paying job, and I decided that this was a perfect opportunity for me to do what I felt led to do, what I felt called to do, and I decided that if my family would support this decision, that I would go forward into full-time teaching. And so I told my wife that I would be starting a little bit early in using our funds that we had saved up to pay myself. And while that doesn't sound like a good financial decision, in most cases, I think most wives would have told them, let's not do that. You go out and get another job, which I'm perfectly capable of doing. But she said, unsurprisingly, because she's been with me for a long time, she said, let's do it. You go ahead and do that. And so today, July the 11th, is 4 years, and it's, things are working. It's okay. So I want to say thank you to everyone who has helped in that regard, and especially to a faithful God who has seen us through. Now, I wanted to add one other thing. I posted on Facebook this beautiful new Bible that I have, and we're going to talk about coveting in a couple of weeks. So don't get too drooly over it, but it is the most beautiful Bible on earth. And I ordered it 8 weeks ago, and it came in. Now, what I find interesting is that the Bible arrived last week, but today, on the anniversary of me going full-time, it's almost like an anniversary gift from heaven. So anyway, that's my introduction this morning. Again, Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for joining with us. We are currently in a series on the 10 words. This is class number 12. Class number 12. And if you're following the white spaces according to the Masoretic text, where the words, if you will, are indicated by spacing within the Hebrew and the English of certain Bibles, you'll realize that we are in word 6. Word 6. So word 6, according to the 10 words, is as they say in the old authorized version of English, this archaic type English, thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, if you look at my translation of those words, which I want you to do, and some of you probably have already posted my 10 words comparison chart in English, you will see that I translate this phrase not as thou shalt not commit adultery, but I translate it as thou shalt not adulterate. Adulterate. Now, I'm using adulterate as a verb. Most translations, most English translations, will add a verb into this phrase and treat adulterate as a thing, as in a thing which is done. You know, if you know your figures of speech, we're not talking, they don't translate it as a verb if you say thou shalt not adulterate, or I'm sorry, if you say thou shalt not commit adultery. Adultery is the thing whereby you're doing, see? Commit is the verb. But commit is typically the word that's inserted there, but in the 10 words, the Hebrew phrase or the Hebrew word that's translated as adultery is a verb. So the first thing that we have to do is to find a suitable English word to fit in for the Hebrew verb, which is brought about as, these are the Hebrew letters that form the root, Nun, Aleph, Pei. Nun, Aleph, Pei is the root. So if you look at, let's say you get out a lexicon or a concordance, I have plenty of these language aids, and you say, what does it really mean? What is the word Nun, Aleph, Pei, which is translated adultery, what does it really mean at its base level? You'll find this without exception. It means adultery. That's what it, in other words, every work, like a lot of times you'll look up a word in Hebrew and it'll give you the root meaning, like shalom. Shalom is the word that we use to greet one another. It means peace. But if you look up the root word, it will tell you it means wholeness, you know, at its root. Shalom means like it's a wholeness. And thereby, peace is somewhat of a wholeness. There are a lot of examples, but the idea is that if I look up Nun, Aleph, Pei in any Hebrew dictionary or concordance or lexicon, it's just going to say adultery. So that means that in order to define, we're going to have to look at context. We're going to have to let the Bible tell us what it means, because the word is a Hebrew word that is defined by how it's defined in the text, if that makes sense. So the question becomes, the first in my mind is adultery, or adulterate as I have it, is that a good fit? Is that what it means? And then, what is adultery? Look, there are a lot of words which are used to describe unauthorized sexual intercourse. There are a lot of different words. Is this the right one? And has our idea in English properly interpreted what that word means? To begin, I wanted to explain the English word adultery. Now, some of you may think that the root in the English of adultery is adult, right? I mean, adultery, adult, you think maybe this is about, maybe it came about by two adults, you know, in an adult situation, you know, and that's how we get the name adultery or the word adultery. But that's not the case. And by the way, let me go ahead and say, I got a note that somebody didn't have sound, but others do. So if you don't have sound, we're getting sound out now, so the problem isn't on this end at this time. So I wanted to say, by the way, that this class will cover adult content, all right? It will cover adult content, and I will obviously present that in a careful way, but I realize that some people have their children listening. This is a topic which involves things which aren't necessarily, you have to make the call. Do you want your kids to hear this or not? So that's my disclaimer. I will be discreet. I will be careful. But adultery is a sexual sin. It's a sexual sin. It's a crime. But by the way, adultery, the root of adultery is not adult. It's not adult. Adult comes from the Latin. I love language. And the Latin behind the word adult is adolescere, which means to grow up. You know our word adolescence. Adolescere is the actual root. If you trace it back, you'll find that that is the root. Now, if you want to go to adultery and learn what adultery means, our English word adultery also comes from Latin, but it comes from two Latin words combined. As some of you didn't know, you were going to get a Latin lesson today, but this is important because what I want to do is say, do we or do we not have the right English word, and what does it really mean? So get this. Adultery. The Latin behind that, the two root words that are combined is ad and alter. Ad and alter. Ad means to or near, and alter means other. Ad, to or near, alter, other. So the idea is that when these are combined into the Latin word adulterare, it means to pollute, to defile, to come near an other. To come near an other. Now, I want you to remember that because it's going to be key in understanding. But it's also, if you look up the word to adulterate, it can mean to pollute, to defile. Like if you take a pure substance and you put something else in it that doesn't belong, I want you to understand where I'm going with this, and you mix it in, you have adulterated it in that idea. By putting something in something that doesn't belong, you are adulterating it, you are polluting it, you are diluting it, you are basically contaminating it. Okay, so those are the ideas that I want you to get. The idea of the Latin brought into the English is that you are near to someone other. And it involves diluting, polluting, putting something where it doesn't belong. Okay? So at the outset, we need to understand that this particular subject matter deals with a sexual offense. I will show you today, and hopefully, if you're not already, I will convince you that this is one of the gravest sins or crimes that can be committed in the human realm. It is that bad. I think a lot of people think in our modern day that, what's the big deal? It's two consenting adults, No, it is destructive. It is destroying and bringing ruination on untold billions of people on this planet today. It is that serious. It's a crime. So we're going to go through some examples. We're going to talk about what is and what is not adultery. Again, remember I mentioned earlier, there are other words people talk about, harlotry and whoredom and things of that nature, different subject matter. The Bible has a lot to say about sex. It's very clear about what is and is not acceptable in those parameters. But I wanted to tell you that while the Bible is very clear on what is a forbidden union, what is an acceptable union, there are even certain times when sexual intercourse is not isn't approved, right? According to the Bible. The Bible says a lot, is what I'm saying. Now, I'm not taking today's class down that path. I'm not going to talk about human sexuality from the Bible. I'm not speaking that broadly. In fact, that would be an entire series on its own. And some of you may want to do a series on that. We might have to do one. But again, there's too much. What I want to do is narrowly focus on one particular aspect of human sexuality within the Hebrew Bible. And my class is very specific, very focused, and I begin with the phrase, lo tinaf. Lo tinaf. Lo tinaf is what is translated, thou shalt not commit adultery, or what I have translated, no, or you shall not adulterate. Very literally, no, you shall adulterate. That's the most literal form. So what does it mean? Now, at the outset, I want to say this as well. What constitutes adultery for men and for women? And are they different? You might be surprised. Because in our mind, we have an idea, we think we know what it means, and we define things as we think they are, or as we wish that they were. What I'm interested in is, what does the Bible say, and biblically, is adultery for men mean one thing, and for women mean something else? We ready? Okay, so adultery is related to some other commands, I might add, within and outside of the 10 words. Let me explain. How many of you, I heard Sherry say this morning the phrase spiritual adultery. Have you ever heard that phrase? So there is an association with spiritual adultery. In fact, many of the examples of adultery in the Bible, of the word nun aleph pei, are dealing with spiritual adultery. And let me tell you what that means. It means that God, Jehovah, is supposed to be the one and only. And so when Israel goes after other gods, Elohim Akarim, that is explained by the prophets as adultery. It's sometimes referred to as harlotry, but most often as adultery. And the difference between adultery and harlotry is, harlotry, you make money for it. Adultery, you do out of passion and lust. You don't charge anything. It's just wickedness. So the two can be compared, but they're different, you see. So the prophets are very clear over and over and over when they want to describe Israel's departure from its one true love, from its Baal, its master, its Lord, what we would say husband in English. It's usually referred to as adultery, nun aleph pei. In fact, Hosea is told to go marry a woman, and a lot of people say a harlot, but there's some tricky language in there. In fact, in some places, it's almost like she belongs to another. We're not going to go there, but I'm telling you. So he's told, I want you to go do this and take this woman who is, of ill repute, and you're going to have children with her. Why, Hosea might ask? I'm glad you asked, Hosea, because I want you to understand as my spokesman the way I feel. My people have been unfaithful to me, just as Gomer will be unfaithful to you. Spiritual adultery. Over and over and over, the prophets use zana, which is the word for harlotry, and the word nun aleph pei in its various forms to describe promiscuity, adultery that is common among the people. So that's spiritual adultery. I'm not teaching today's class on spiritual adultery. I just simply couldn't fit it all in. But know that it's there, know that it's real, And it is interesting that if you look at the two what we call the two tablets, and some people believe they're commandments that deal with God on one side, and that's not biblical, but you get the idea, and some that deal with the human interactions on the other, these relate. Adultery and taking away the exclusivity of God go together. Now there's another idea that relates to this adultery. What about stealing, which is next? Theft. Because what I will show today is that in a way, the big, let's call them the big three, murder, adultery, and theft, you know, they're really all basically come down to the same problem. You're taking something that's not yours to take. Whether it's a life, a wife, or just anything in general. I mean, in a way, that's what it is. The problem people, the bad people, or the people who do bad, are the takers. Unauthorized takers. All right, so we'll get into, as we work through over the next several weeks, other connections. But obviously, taking what belongs to another, or I might say it better by saying, what is not yours to take. Because you could say, well, this doesn't belong to anybody. It's sitting in a store. Well, you can't take it if it's not yours, right? You have to own it. So it's reaching one of the biggest crimes, if you pull all these together, in the world today is this idea of unauthorized taking. We see it on the news now. People think they have a right to go in and take other people's things. Theft, robbery, and so forth. It's horrible. It's a crime. It's a crime against God's established order is what it is. The root word nun aleph pei occurs in the Hebrew Bible 34 times in 29 verses. 34 times in 29 verses. The majority of which deal with spiritual adultery. But we can understand exactly what this sin is by looking at some key text. Now, here's a surprise for you. How many times would you think that nun aleph pei occurs in the Torah? Somebody play that. Dun, 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 dun. It's like a question. I want you to, everybody put your guess up. Nobody Google it. Nobody, how many verses does nun aleph pei appear in? Anybody? Hold up your hand. Just, you don't have to say it out loud so you won't be embarrassed. I'm giving you a clue. 3 verses. Two of which are the 10 words. The 10 words, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 14 and Deuteronomy 5:18, that's the 10 words account in Exodus and Deuteronomy respectively. And that's 2 of the 3. Now, one other verse in the Torah, the phrase occurs. So go with me this morning to the book of Leviticus. Even if your Bible is not as beautiful as mine, it's still the Word of God. Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 10. Leviticus 20 and verse 10. And it says, and the man that commits adultery with another man's wife, that commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall be surely put to death. All right? And that's it. And that has the root nun aleph pei occurs several times in that verse. It is translated, as you can see, as adulterer, adultery, adulteress. All those come from the nun aleph pei verse. But we pick up a couple of ideas when we read it. If you look at it, notice where it says with another man's wife. All right, that's going to be a key to understanding what it means to commit adultery, as we say in English. And then look, it says with his neighbor's wife. You see that? Now, I want to let you know that technically there's no word for wife in Hebrew. All right? Yeah, let me clarify. We assign our concept into the Hebrew Bible. So like they didn't go to the justice of the peace and get a formal piece of paper and so forth, whole nother story. But a wife is typically a woman, it's Isha, or a form of Isha. Ish is man, Isha is woman. So generally when you see the English say wife, the Hebrew behind it usually says the woman of a man. The woman of a man. Now, a lot of people in our culture would say, well, I don't like that. I'm a feminist and I don't belong to any man. Well, if you're biblical, you need to not say things like that because it's not this lording over idea. It's that you are in a covenant relationship and you belong. You belong. You're a woman of a man. You're connected, right? It's not this idea that a lot of people who don't understand spiritual things get. So here, technically, even though the word wife is not something that we see in the Hebrew, we see woman of a man. In here, it's eshet ish. Eshet ish. Eshet is in the construct, and so it means woman of an ish. An isha of an ish. So the crime is that if a man here takes a woman of a man or a woman of his neighbor and has intercourse with her, both should die. And you go, well, that's a little bit harsh. It is in our culture, but it's destroying the fabric of society. And this is what we need to understand is biblically the idea is that this is a ruination causing crime. All right, and we're gonna look more at this. So there are two passages outside of the Torah that I want to begin with today that exclude the allegorical. So like I don't want to get into the spiritual adultery piece. I want to look at a couple of passages which aren't really allegorical, which aren't being symbolic, and they're just looking from the outside at adulterers, adulteresses, and saying, here's the biblical idea of it. So go with me to the book of Proverbs, and I want you to go to chapter 30, Proverbs chapter 30. And I just want to read verse 20, Proverbs 30:20. And it says, likewise, the way of an adulterous woman, she eats, wipes her mouth, and says, I've done nothing wrong. The idea that we get here, I'm going to demonstrate, is someone just carefree, brazen in her sin. I didn't do anything wrong. And in our society today, many people think that it's okay. Well, biblically, it's not. Go with me to Ezekiel chapter 16, and I'll say at the outset that Ezekiel 16 is a very, very tough read. And I'm only going to read a single verse. It is, for the most part, an allegory about two promiscuous sisters that are describing Israel and Judah. And they're both very, very naughty. But in Ezekiel 16, I want you to look at verse 32, Ezekiel 16 and verse 32. And it says, let's see where it starts. Let me look at the Hebrew. 32. But rather like a wife that commits adultery, who takes strangers instead of her husband. Remember, wife and husband aren't really there in the Hebrew so much. That's our English. What it really says is, in this particular passage, the woman who adulterates, and then it has literally in the Hebrew, the atnak is like a semicolon in English. The first part of the verse says, the woman who adulterates, semicolon, instead of her man, she takes strangers. So how do we find or define what adultery is in terms of a woman? I want to make this clear. In terms of a woman, if a woman who is the woman of a man. Now, in biblical language, that means betrothed. We might say engaged, or I don't know, in my day, you could, Bridget and I were going, we called it going. You want to go with me? Yeah, I'll go with you. Then it got to be, you want to talk? And I don't know what they call it these days, but that was a long time ago. We're talking 40 years ago. I remember asking Bridget to go with me. And she obviously said yes, and she's still going with me. So we were a couple way back then. So the idea is that biblically, if one is with someone, now some would say, well, you just going together doesn't matter. I'm not so sure. I want to be careful here. I'm not going to give you liberty to say, well, we're just dating. I can do whatever I want. Promiscuity is promiscuity. So it needs to be some very strict guidelines. So the idea, though, again, in Ezekiel 16, this passage is that the woman who adulterates, now we're going to define that. Instead, this is what the Hebrew says, instead of her man, she takes strangers. And the word in Hebrew is takes. All right, she accepts strangers. Now I want to go to the book of Numbers, to Bamidbar, Numbers chapter 5, and I want to look at a very strange ritual. I'm not going to read it. It's not the absolute purpose of my class, but I do want to highlight several things within Numbers chapter 5 by way of understanding what Nun Aleph Pei means and really understand this subject matter for today's class. So Numbers chapter 5, verses 11 through 31 deals with what in Hebrew is called the Sotah, S-O-T-A-H, Sotah. That's the English transliteration. Sotah means to turn aside. To turn aside. Very literally, it means to turn aside. So if you go down to verse 29 of chapter 5, just to give you what we're studying here, when we deal with the Sotah, verse 29 says, this is the Torah, or the Torah of jealousies, when a woman goes aside or turns aside to another instead of her husband and is defiled. Okay? So when a woman, this is a definition for you, for a woman, when a woman turns aside, right, to another instead of her man, and she's defiled. Again, we're defining what in, now, by the way, the word Nun Aleph Pei is never used in here, but we established already that these ideas of going to someone other than her man is what really we're defining as adultery. So verse 29 tells us that what chapter 5 of Numbers is, it is the Torah haknaot, the instructions, plural, of jealousies. It's a really strange priestly document. That's what I'll say. And it really comes down to this. If a man suspects that his wife has been unfaithful, that she's slept with another person, he brings her to the priest, and there's this really bizarre ritual that takes place. Dirt from the floor of the tabernacle is mixed in some water, and it's stirred up, and the woman is caused to pronounce a certain oath, and then she will then drink the water, and if she's guilty, according to this priestly ritual, bad things happen. Now, it's kind of difficult to understand. Will she miscarry? Some commentators believe it's a miscarriage-producing thing, but it's really gruesome. If you read it in the English, it's kind of unclear. It's a really strange. It's called a ritual by ordeal. I'm not going to go through the whole ritual. I just want you to understand where we're coming from. So a woman, verse 29 says, turns aside instead of her man, and she defiles herself. Now in Hebrew, what we're talking about is ritual defilement, and the word there in Hebrew is tameh, and it can mean to be made unclean. So this has got repercussions on a spiritual level, but it's also, it needs to be understood for what it is. Now go with me to chapter 5, and I want to begin in verse 11 of Numbers 5:11. And Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, if a man's woman, I'm correcting where it says wife, if a man's woman go aside and commits a trespass against him, and a man lie with her carnally, English is going to really soften up the Hebrew, by the way, and it be hid from the eyes of her husband, and she be undetected, and she be defiled, and there is no witness against her, nor is she taken in the act. All right? So this is when a woman sneaks around on her husband, and nonetheless, if she did this, she is defiled. These are the points that I want to bring up, is that what she's done, the allegation is, whether she is guilty or not, if she did this, get this, if she did this, meaning if she turned aside from her man to accept in her another man, she has broken faith. She's acted unfaithfully, is the way that the Hebrew Bible puts it, and she's defiled herself. Now, verse 14 also mentions, and she is defiled, right? I'm just going to go through and hit a few high points. The point is, if she did this, she's become unclean. Then verse 19, if a man has not lain with you, this is the priest talking to her later, and if you've not turned aside towards uncleanness instead of your man, you see, I want to develop this idea that this is the crime, to turn aside to uncleanness, which is what it is, instead of your man. And verse 20 says to turn aside instead of your man becoming unclean. Translations are going to vary, but this is the point. You see, the three here. I'm looking at causative. What are the results of this crime? So, verse 20: turn aside instead of your man becoming clean, and a man give you intercourse other than your man. Right? And then verse 27: defiled herself, broke faith with her man. And then finally in verse 28 it says, if she's not defiled herself, then she's clean. All right. So these ideas are very important to understand from a biblical perspective. What is the responsibility of a woman of a man, which is what I'm dealing with so far? A woman of a man must not defile herself, breaking faith with her man by turning aside and accepting another man. All right? Most people would say, well, yeah, I already knew that. Okay, well, good. Put a check mark. You already knew that. For a woman to turn aside to any man other than her man to lay sexually with him is a breach of faith, makes her unclean, defiled, and impure. By the way, in English, we have a term called polyandry. Polyandry is the idea, it's the term for a woman who has two or more husbands. In our understanding of it, she has two or more men. And by the way, biblically, you can't do that. Polyandry is not acceptable. Biblically, a woman is a one-man woman. Sorry, ladies. Some of you are thinking, thank God. You know, I couldn't deal with more than one in any aspect. So most women are happy with that. All right. Biblically, however, a man can have, now look, I need everybody to promise you're going to listen to the end, because some of you are going to hang up and say, I'm out of here. I'm going to go get another woman. Listen to me. The Bible says that a man can have more than one woman. Take a deep breath. With some restrictions. Take another breath. There's a difference in can you and should you. We'll talk about that. This, by the way, a man having more than one woman is not called polygamy with an M. Polygamy with an M is any from either side. A person can have more than one spouse. So polygamy is the word that describes where women can have more than one man and men can have more than one woman. That's both. Polyandry deals with a woman having more than one husband, and polygyny with an N is a man having more than one woman. So there you go. So polygyny is acceptable in the Bible. Now, we know this for a lot of reasons. If you look at the ancient Near East, as we get it in the biblical narratives, you look at the patriarchs, they had more than one woman. Now, we know that all of these situations were not ideal. We know that it created and introduced great difficulties into a family unit. I mean, just study the lives of Abraham, not Isaac. Isaac only had one, right? Isaac seems to have one of the sanest lives of the patriarchs, and that's not an attack on women. So don't get your feathers ruffled. This is straight up. His life seems to be a little more calm than the others. Look, it's not ideal, which we're going to talk about, but it is acceptable. If you look at, go for instance to Deuteronomy 21. Deuteronomy 21 and verse 15. And by the way, I'm just reading between the white spaces here, Deuteronomy 21, 15 through 17. If a man have two wives, one beloved and another hated. You get that? And they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated. And if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be when he makes his sons to inherit that which he has, that he may not give the preference to the son of the beloved wife over the son of the hated wife, who is the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the hated for the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. Deuteronomy 21, 15 through 17. If a man has two women, he loves one and he hates one, right? And most of us only have one, so they got to be the same. The one you love and the one you hate have to be the same one. And the women are stuck with one that they have to love and hate too. You can't, okay. But this, I'm talking biblically. The crime of adultery for a man is not having more than one woman. That's not what adultery is for a man. I want to stress this. For a woman, adultery is taking any man other than her man. For a man, biblically, anciently, that's not adultery in and of itself. There are other things which have to be part of this to make it adultery. So again, I told you have to listen to the whole thing. Because some of you are like, okay, I heard all I need to hear. No, you haven't. All right, now go with me to Leviticus 18. Leviticus 18 and verse 20. Leviticus 18 and verse 20. Let's see if that's the one I wanted. 18:20. Okay. Moreover, you shall not lie carnally, again, this is euphemistic in the English, with your neighbor's wife to defile yourself with her. Now, literally, this is my translation, and to a woman of your fellow or your associate. It's not really the word rea for neighbor. It's more of a, it's like telling him to another guy, another one, your fellow. And to a woman of your fellow, no, you shall give your place of lying for seed. It's literally what it says. To become unclean with her. Very graphic, but the idea is don't take the woman of another and have intercourse. The key phrase is the woman of your fellow. A woman of your fellow. In other words, someone who belongs to another is not yours. You can't have sex with them. Just plain as I can make it. Even a guy can understand that. If she's somebody else's, she is not yours. Keep your hands off. By the way, notice that when someone commits nun aleph pei, when they adulterate, whether a man or a woman, even though the definition for each is slightly different, the same happens to them. They become defiled. They become unclean. This is a serious offense, and biblically, in the biblical world, it brought the death sentence. I mean, it does to this day as well sometimes. A lot of homicides are when someone catches the other one in adultery. And one of the things that a lot of people would say, well, I'm glad we don't do that anymore. Well, I don't know. I mean, you think about the seriousness and how this devastates the world today, and you have to wonder, should it be? I mean, this is I know people can debate this and say, wow, Ross is off his rocker. He's trying to bring in some kind of Taliban. No, I'm not. I'm just saying, I want us to understand how serious this is. It's not just a few moments of pleasure. You're affecting more than you know. So let's look at a couple of those passages. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 22. Deuteronomy 22 and verse 22. Easy to remember. 22:22. If a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman, so that you shall put away bad or evil from Israel. Let's see, the phrase married to a husband in Hebrew is ve'ulat Baal. And the idea is, again, I said we don't really have the English word husband, but if you trace that English word back, and I know some people will say, I don't like it, the idea of Lord, meaning one who has great responsibility in a relationship. So it's Baal is a Lord. So it really means what these other verses mean. If a man has intercourse with a woman who belongs to another man, both of them die. That's what it says. And that's what we read in Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 10. 20 and verse 10. And a lot of people have said, if there was a death penalty, maybe it would reduce it. I don't know. But I've got the guarantee in my relationship that there would be a death penalty if I did it, so maybe everybody needs that threat, right? Some of the people out there would do the same. And all kidding aside, people die from this. People die because of these wrong relationships. Now, I want you to look with me at some of the effects of a relationship outside of the belonging relationship that the Torah describes. Go with me to Proverbs, and I want you to read with me Proverbs chapter 6, verse 20. Proverbs 6, beginning in verse 20. My son, keep your father's commandment and forsake not the Torah of your mother. Bind them continually upon your heart and tie them about your neck. When you walkest, it will lead you. When you lie down, it will keep you. When you wake, it will talk with you. For the commandment is a lamp and the Torah is a light. And reproofs of instruction are the way of life to keep you from the evil woman, the bad woman. From the smoothness of the tongue of an alien, a stranger is what it means. Lust not after her beauty in your heart, nor let her take you with her eyelids. For by means of a harlot, now you say, well, I thought we were talking about harlot being something different. Stick with me. For by means of a harlot, a man is brought to a piece of bread, and the adulteress will hunt for the precious life. Can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? See, this is what it's saying. You're going to get burned. You get close to fire, you're going to get burned. Can one walk upon hot coals and his feet not be scorched? So he that goes into his neighbor's wife. Whoever touches her shall not go unpunished. Do not men despise a thief, even if he steals to satisfy his soul when he's hungry? And if he's found, he shall restore sevenfold. He shall give all the substance of his house. In other words, listen, you say, I don't care what the excuse is. The point is, if you steal from me, you rob my things, and you go, just let him, he's got a reason, he's got an excuse to steal. He's mad or he's hungry. Don't make excuses. We don't make excuses some people do. Most of us don't make excuses for criminals. Now watch this. He who commits adultery with a woman lacks understanding. And he who does that destroys his soul. A wound and dishonor shall he get, and his reproach shall not be wiped away. For jealousy is the rage of a man, and he will not spare in the day of vengeance. He will not regard any ransom, nor will he rest content, though you give many gifts. Point being, if you you take another man's woman and you're caught, you're ruined. You're going to get burned. You're going to get burned, and listen to this. The person that you've offended, you'll never be able to get them back. You take someone else's woman and have sex with her and then go to them and say, hey, look, I'm sorry about that, Billy. How about some tickets to the Astros game? Right? It's just nothing you can do. No gifts and your reputation. Everybody around in town is going to look at you and say, that person is scum. Can you believe, whispering, can you believe it? He actually slept with Billy's wife. It's bad. Once a person does this, there's no forgiveness, basically. So where it says a married woman in verse 26, just so you understand this, this is dealing with a woman of a man, a woman of a man. Now, I want to read another proverb to you. These are very instructive in this regard. Look at Proverbs 7. Now, I want to read the whole chapter 7. My son, keep my words, lay up my commandments with you. Keep my commandments and live, and my Torah is the apple of your eye. Bind them upon your fingers, write them upon the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister. Call understanding your kinswoman, that they may keep thee from the strange woman, from the alien woman. It's really a word for foreign, but not like someone from another country. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means strange in the sense that it's not your woman, right? Who makes smooth her words. For at the window of my house I looked out through my lattice and beheld among the simple ones. I discerned among the youths a young man void of understanding passing through the street near her corner. And he went the way to her house in the twilight in the evening, in the blackness of a dark night. And behold, there met him a woman with the attire of a harlot. And the wily of heart, she is noisy and ungovernable. Her feet do not remain in her house. Now is she outside, now in the streets, and she lies in wait at every corner. She caught hold of him and kissed him, and with an impudent face said to him, I've had to sacrifice peace offerings. This day have I paid my vows, so I came out to meet thee. Diligently to seek your face, and I found you. I decked my bed with coverings, with tapestry of Egyptian yarn. I perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until the morning. Let us delight ourselves with loves. Get this, for my man is not at home. He's on a long journey. He's taken a bag of money with him and will come home at the full moon. With her much fair speech, she causes him to yield, and with smoothness of her lips, she seduces him. He goes after her at once, as an ox goes to the slaughter, and as a man in chains to the chastisement of a fool, till a dart strike through his liver, as a bird hastens to the snare and knows that not that it is for his life. Now, the biblical writers, and some women feel this, a lot of times you get the sense that, you know, the woman, I mean, she's going to all these extremes. The woman's bad, and you know what I mean? In other words, like the woman is the one that's enticing him and all of that. But when I read this, I see also this guy is just as bad as she is. He doesn't resist. He goes right along with it. The biggest thing I see in this, the way that I think most men think, she probably did way more than she needed to do to get him. You know what I'm saying? I mean, she went to a lot of extreme. But anyway. But the idea is that the man in this scenario is away and he's got a bag of money, he's not coming back for a while, but she belongs to someone else. The prohibition for a man is taking another man's woman. And the minute she says, in scenario Proverbs 7, my husband is away, he should say, oh, you're married? She told him. Now go with me let me show you how men are supposed to act. This is a good one for you. Teach your boys this. This is the way men are supposed to act. Genesis 39. Genesis 39 and verse 7. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife, cast her eyes upon Joseph. And she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, my master knows not what is with me in the house. And he's committed all that he has to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his woman. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now, I want you to understand something, that this story is the example that we ought to teach our boys. If someone belongs to another, your answer is no. It's not a matter of two consenting adults and what harm is it going to be, what harm is it going to do. Listen, it destroys and ruins the family. You understand how serious that is? You understand that the family is the bedrock of society. To introduce sin into the family is the most heinous crime that I can imagine. So boys need to hear, if someone approaches you and they're the person that belongs to another, your answer has to be no. I will not. You heard there are other fish in the sea. Find a fish that's not with someone. You find a single person. Now, if you know the story, she continues. It's not like this is easy for him to say no to. In fact, at one point, she grabs his garment. You know the story. He has to run out without his garment on. And then she says, he took me, and then he gets in trouble and goes to jail. But it doesn't matter. You can't succumb to bad at the threat of what someone might say. That's part of what's wrong with our society today. We have to be willing to stand on principles like Joseph. Having sex with her, identified clearly in this text, it would have been a sin to God. Now, how do you not act? Let me give you one example of how not to act. 2 Samuel 11 describes David and how he responded when the time of war was going on and he stayed back. He goes out on his roof, 2 Samuel 11, and he sees a beautiful woman bathing, and he asks a question. Who is that? And he was told, that's the wife of another man, Uriah. But he doesn't care. That should have been enough that he said, okay then, I wish she wouldn't bathe there, but she's not mine. But he didn't. He took her, he got her pregnant, and then, as you know the story, to save face, he has the husband killed, who from all accounts, when you read the story, was a noble and righteous, wonderful, wonderful man. We can't defend David's actions in this. David did wickedly. David knew it, Jehovah knew it, and Bathsheba knew it. This is bad. It's one of the worst stories in the Bible. The fact that it's in here is amazing, because someone as famous in the biblical stories as King David, we get to see his human frailties, which is also another warning. Don't be so haughty, like I would never. Well, I mean, David was a man after God's own heart. Temptation is very, very strong when it comes to sexual urges. I mean, this is bad. But, now here's the thing. What I want to do, I want you to go with me to 2 Samuel chapter 12, 2 Samuel chapter 12. And I want to read you this. I know you know this story, but I just want you to read with me chapter 12 of 2 Samuel 1 through 7. And Jehovah sent Nathan to David. And he came to him and said to him, there are two men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and reared, and he grew up together with him and with his children. And it did eat of his own bread, and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was like a daughter to him. And there came a traveler to the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock and of his own herd, to prepare it for the wayfaring man that was come to him. But took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man that was come to him. And David's anger burned greatly against the man. And he said to Nathan, as Jehovah lives, the man that has done that is worthy to die. And he shall restore that lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, thou art that man. Now I want you to think about that. Think about that story. It is so powerful that it and it alone, anyone with a conscience, anyone with a heart, should never take the woman of another man. That story alone. A lot of times men move in a situation where the relationship is troubled. The woman may be looking at her husband as, man, I wish that my husband looked like that man, or behaved like that man, or dressed like that man, or had a job like that man, or had a... And a man might be looking at a woman saying, I wish my wife dressed like that, or could cook like that, or had a job like that, or what. We tend to focus too much energy on looking at what others. Because let me tell you something, and I'll do a little bit more of this in just a moment. No matter what you see, that's not the whole story. Friend of mine, I'll tell you this, I'll clean it up a good bit. Some of you are delicate. Friend of mine was fed up with marriage. And he called me and he said, I don't know how you do it. He said, I'm telling you, I'm fed up. My wife is so mean, she sleeps with her fist balled up. He said, she hates me. I want to divorce her. We had a long talk. And I said, look, I'm a Hebrew Bible guy. The Hebrew Bible does say, but I said, I want you to think about this. You have children. I'm big on the family. Is there anything? Can we get you to counseling? Could you, I know your wife, could you come talk to me? Maybe we could. He said, I don't know. I don't want to be in the same room with her. Could we do it over? I said, no. So anyway, one night he called me. It's 1 a.m, and he was drunk. He was in a bar. And he said, I saw a sign. He said, are you awake? I said, yeah. Yeah, I'm awake. What can I do for you? He said, it was hanging in the bar room, and it said something that made me remember your talk with me. So what did it say? I'm thinking, my God, he's seeing stuff in a bar room that reminds him of our conversations. But he said, the sign says, no matter how pretty she is, no matter how much she laughs at your jokes, somewhere somebody is probably fed up with her too. Now you can switch that story around and make it a man. But the idea is that we tend to look at what the other person might have that ours doesn't. And that may be true. But people are very complex. And what you get with that is a package deal. So I want us to think, whenever I read 2 Samuel chapter 12, that story alone is so powerful. In fact, if you on your own will read Psalm 51, which is the psalm that David wrote after he's been called on the carpet about the issue with Bathsheba, think about it in that context and how broken he is. And remember what happens in the story. It's a horror-filled story. It brings about death and ruination. Not only is Uriah killed, a child dies. Families are wrecked and destroyed. There is a good reason that adulterers can be called home wreckers. Men and women. Because children grow up with people other than the parents that are their parents because of this crime. It destroys lives. Some people are ruined forever because they never see that family, nuclear family unit that was supposed to be around them. It is one of the most destructive sins in the world today. And what makes it so destructive, besides what I just said, is that people have almost accepted it. Like we hear about a divorce. Divorce is bad enough. It has to happen, and the Torah talks about divorce. But sometimes when we hear about a divorce, you're like, well, what happened? I don't know. I don't know. But all of a sudden, this person is now with this person. It doesn't take a brilliant person to put it together. Infidelity, adultery. Somebody thought somebody was better than the one they had. Okay. Biblically, here's the nutshell as I begin to wind things down. Biblically, if a man wants to have sex with a woman, he can't or she can't be the woman of another man. Right? That's the rule. Write that down. She can't be the woman of another man. Otherwise, he has adulterated. If a woman wants to have sex with a man, she can't be the woman of another man. You notice how that piece stays the same? That's the rule. Now, I'm talking whether or not that means married or betrothed, what I guess we would call engaged is the closest thing we have. Otherwise, she's adulterated. The ideal is very simple, though, and pure. Ruth said it, I am to my beloved, and my beloved is to me. Think about that. Or as Stephen Stills said, you know Crosby, Stills, and Nash? Love the one you're with? It's a secular song, but the phrase hit me. You might think, well, I don't even love that person anymore. How many times have you, if you've been married a while, you go through phases. You know, you go through, and I'm not trying to be a total marriage counselor here, but I have been married a long time. And you go through the ebbs and flows. And there are times where I am probably the husband that Bridget hates. Maybe once or twice. And there are plenty of times where I'm the husband that she loves. But through it all, she stayed true. You know, there are always opportunities for us to commit crime and sin. But if you love the one you're with, you remember the show Fiddler on the Roof? When Tevye sees his daughter and she's all in love and she's talking about, but I love him, Daddy. And I remember he asked his wife, he said, do you love me? And she's folding clothes or something, and she looks at him with a scowl. She said, do I love you? He said, yeah, do you love me? She said, do I love you? 25 years I washed your clothes. I cooked your meals. So she makes the point. The point is, our definition of love is sometimes only visual. And that is absolutely the wrong way. You can't see love, so stop trying. What you'll see is not love. Don't use your eyes. What your eyes can pick up on is lust and things like that. I'm not saying you shouldn't admire the beauty of your spouse, but that's not where the love is. I don't think it is, because you'll look for it somewhere else. Focus your energy on the one you have. Adultery ruins. Everyone who thinks another will be better is generally wrong. Grass is greener. Don't be fooled by green grass. It comes down to this: leave other people's people alone. Look with me at Proverbs again. Proverbs 5. Proverbs 5. And verse 18. Let thy fountain be blessed, Proverbs 5:18, and rejoice with the wife of your youth, a loving hind and a pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. And why will you, my son, be ravished with a strange woman and embrace the bosom of a stranger? For the ways of man are before the eyes of Jehovah, and he ponders all his goings. His own iniquities shall trap the wicked man, and he shall be caught fast in the cords of sins. He will die for want of instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. Ecclesiastes 9, verse 9 says, Ecclesiastes 9:9, live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your life. And I think people need to remember that. Now, men who think that biblically, because of Deuteronomy 21, that they have a free pass to have more than one woman, you know, because they could say, well, I'm going to get one, and she's not going to be somebody else's woman, so biblically I can do it. Well, look, listen. Difference in can and should. Remember that. Be careful what you ask for. The ideal, I believe, is found in Genesis chapter 2, and I want to close with this, Genesis 2. I want to read you verse 18. Genesis 2:18 says, and Jehovah Elohim said, it's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helpmeet to match him. Now in Hebrew it's Ezer Kenegdo, and it means a helper like his opposite. I'm going to make him a helper like his opposite. You ever hear somebody say, I got to get somebody else because we just don't have anything in common? Well, good. That's probably who you're supposed to have. Work on your differences and find ways that they complement one another. You might be in the perfect relationship. Look at verse 21. And verse 21 says, "And Jehovah Elohim caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept, and he took one of his sides and closed up the flesh in its place. And of the side which Jehovah Elohim had taken from the man, he made a woman, brought her to the man, and the man said, This is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called Isha, because she was taken out of man. And that's why a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his woman, and they become one flesh." You know the old marriage vows that say, "What God has joined together, let not anyone tear asunder"? Don't be that one. Nun Aleph Pei, we saw examples of adultery made, whether male or female, makes one unclean and defiled. It comes down to this: don't adulterate, meaning don't draw near to one that isn't yours, who is another's. Love yours and yours alone, and leave others other alone. Love the one you're with. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov, and next week we'll keep this series going, so don't miss it.